morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Center for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Linnea into the circle today to chat with us about creative wellness. It seems like a bit of an abstract title, but we hope through the course of the session it'll become clear kind of what we're chatting about. Before we get into any of that, though, I would like to acknowledge that we're here on the traditional, ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for generously funding the Learning Circle and all the stuff that we do here. So, as a quick reminder to everyone participating today, the topics we cover can sometimes be personal, emotional, and sensitive. If that's you for today, if the conversation strays that way for you, please make sure that you have a support system in place to help you navigate that. That's an elder, a friend, family member, counselor, or phone line, whatever it is that you need, please make sure that you're accessing those services. So, brief introductions for us before I'm just going to turn the mic over to the person that we actually tuned in to listen to. My name is Cole. I'm from the Chawatho First Nation. I'll be facilitating the session today, so just kind of acting as a bounce board for Linnea. Other Learning Circle team members today in the room but off camera are Cynthia, our production coordinator, and Kaylin, our program assistant. As you can see, there's a chat box on your, I think it's on your right-hand side of the screen. So please make sure that you populate that with questions. Say hi to Linnea if you know her. We'd love to make sure that we're feeling supported today. So with that, I'm just going to let's start with our first question, and I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Yeah. My name is Linnea Dick, and I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw, Nisga'a, and Tsimshian nations here on the northwest coast of Canada. And where do I even begin to speak about myself? I guess I can share my Kwakwaka'wakw name, my Kwakwala name, which is Maladi. And what Maladi means is to know what your destination is, but on your way to be drawn to various different places, and that each stop along the way is where you're meant to be. And I always like to share that because I think that it's with that power that I'm here today, and I'm able to share a part of my story today. I grew up mostly urban, so I grew up in Vancouver here. And but I'm also from a small community called Alert Bay on the northern tip of Vancouver Island, and those two very different backgrounds largely influence who I am today. So I have a strong connection to my culture, to my traditions. Those are things that are super important to me, but I also do a lot of projects that I'm passionate about, such as curating and writing poetry and working with youth and traveling, doing workshops with people. And so it's hard to introduce myself because I wear a lot of hats and I have a lot of influences in my life, but I guess we can start there.
Mm-hmm. Actually, it inspired a question right away for me, and it relates to your name, like the name that you were gifted.
Mm-hmm.
Two-part question. When did that happen for you? And then the more meaty one for me is, when you were gifted that name, were you aware of the meaning of the name and all of its implications at that time? Or is it something you kind of discover as you transition through your life? Like that the name takes on new meanings that you maybe didn't understand when you had first received it. Do you know what I mean? Does it kind of evolve with time as you evolve as a person?
Yeah, I definitely believe it did. I received that name as a baby, and so I grew up with my dad sharing with me what that name meant, and he also used it as a teaching for me when I felt challenged in life, when I felt really down, when I felt like there was no way to move forward. He would remind me, well, that's what your name means. But I think that something that every person experiences in their life is that lack of acceptance. So I think that in some point in all of our lives, we lived in such a way where when bad things happened, we didn't think it was meant to happen. We felt that it was unfair. We felt that somehow we were brought to a place where we didn't deserve. And in some cases that can be very true, but I also have learned over time to embrace those teachings, that when something bad happens, there is something there. And it's not always easy, and I think sometimes I have to fight with myself to find that thing, because it's so much easier to blame life than to accept the bad things that can come with it sometimes.
Mm-hmm. That's
Yeah.
beautiful. Funny that you brought up your dad.
Yeah.
Kind of one of the next questions, and maybe inspired by that piece there, is that it sounds like you guys had a very close relationship from when you were
Absolutely.
very young. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, that influence in your life as you were growing up?
Yeah, I think that when I was young, I didn't realize how fortunate I was to have a dad like him.
Mm-hmm.
I really went through normal childhood things. I thought my dad was one of the dumbest people I've ever met in my life.
Yep. Yep.
I thought that he thought he was better than me, that he knew me better than I did, all those like various things and teen angst.
Yep.
I experienced very normal things, but something that always kept me close to my dad was not what everybody else sees, but my own personal relationship, my friendship with him. He was one of the most playful people in the world. I was able to talk with him about things that I've never been able to talk to anyone else about, and we had a lot of similar beliefs about life and about humanity and about the world, and I think that those things really kept us close over the years, that no matter what happened, no matter what disagreements we had, and no matter how much our paths in life sort of separated, we always have those things that we can come back to. But growing up, people would say, like, oh, what's it like to have Bo as a father? And he was the only dad I grew up with. And so in that way, I was very privileged. And in my young adult life, maybe when I was about 22-ish, I would look around me and I would wonder why people who experienced the same challenges that I did let those things affect who they are in the world. For example, I was sexually abused, and I used that part of my history as a way to empower myself, to find strength in that story, and to realize that I've overcome that. But at one point, I expected that from others. I thought, everyone should just be able to heal. And I didn't realize what a privilege it was to grow up with a father who was so supportive, so wise, so open to the experiences of others, so willing to hear the pain, to work through that pain with you. And so it took a long time for me to realize what a gift of a person he was, how magical he was. And then even once you discover that, I think anyone who knew my dad, whether as, a family or as a friend or as Bo Dick, the artist, they would learn that he was just a gift that kept giving. You were always learning new things about him, new magical things that he could do. And that definitely really inspired me in my life to live that way, to live in a way that I am always learning and I'm always giving and I'm always trying to become more and more of who I'm meant to be, and become more conscious in this world, that I am becoming who I am meant to be, but this life I'm living isn't just about me. It's about everything and how everything is connected together. And I mean, I could share teachings that he shared with me for days, probably. But those are like some of the main ways that he really impacted my life.
Did you ever feel like, because you're an artist and he is an artist, did you ever feel any weight of pressure or expectation on that? Because of how beautiful and wonderful of a person and artist he was, especially when you were younger. I get self-conscious if I try and play hockey because my dad played hockey. I can't imagine the amount of pressure that you might have felt. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. And I definitely experienced that feeling that I would never fill his shoes. And it wasn't until later, he would always tell me, you have your own gifts and I want you to live your life the way that you want to. But I would look at him and I would just feel so small next to him. As much as he wanted me to feel great, I just felt so small. And it wasn't just him. I grew up in a community of artists because of who my dad was. Whenever I lived with my dad, we had a shop in our kitchen. There was always men, sitting around and carving and listening to loud music and wood chips everywhere. But being in that space, I also got to witness some of those amazing conversations that artists have, and met a lot of different artists, but most of those artists were visual artists. And when I was about 13, people would always say, "Oh, do you carve? Are you an artist like your dad?" It was never, "Are you an artist?" And so I found myself comparing myself to him throughout my life, but not only as an artist, but as a person, and feeling very inferior. And I think that another huge influence of that was that my oldest sister, her name is Linnea Dick, is an exquisite weaver. She is one of the most amazing weavers that I've ever encountered. She had a very natural gift for that. And so these being two people who I really admire, my oldest sister and my father, it was very easy to not see myself for who I truly was. And when I was a young girl, I've written poetry since I was maybe 5. I've just always enjoyed that. And when I was about 10 or so, I was at my grandmother's house in our spare bedroom watching TV. I believe I was watching Star Trek, and my dad came in and he said, "Oh, what are you watching?" And he looked towards the TV, and I had a little card sitting under there, and he picked it up and he read it. And I remember my heart stopping and feeling like, this is embarrassing. What is he going to think of my poem? And he just looked at me and he said, "Wow, this is so absolutely beautiful, but it kind of disturbs me because I don't understand how you know about things this deep already." And I think that I really expressed my innate wisdom or my understanding of life through my poetry from a very young age. But I never considered art to be, for poetry to be an art for a very, very long time. I always thought art is something that you do and something that is tangible. You can pick it up, you can hang it on a wall. And that understanding of art changed through the connection to my Indigenous identity as a Kwakwaka'wakw woman, especially. I know that in a lot of Indigenous communities and cultures that a lot of their languages don't have a word for art. And I believe that comes from the fact that as people in our communities, we really understood the creative being. Everything we did was so creative. The way we built our houses was immaculate. And every single thing we put up in our houses had meaning. And then when we made our clothes, everything had meaning. The way we put it together, the crests that we put on it. And a lot of these things were really community-based. So, everyone had their hands in this creation. And it brought everyone together. And so it was a very healing experience. And so it took a long time for me to really understand what art is from my identity as a Kwakwaka'wakw woman. To take that step back and realize that we're all creative beings, that we're all creating the world around us, and that we create differently. And something that I learned through my work with We Matter, which is a nonprofit committed to hope and instilling within youth hope, culture, and strength, Indigenous youth. Something that I learned through that work was this idea of heart, body, mind, spirit, which I think is a part of a lot of Eastern Indigenous cultures. And when I learned about that, it took me a while to kind of wrap my head around, because I think that I wasn't as aware that there was different parts of myself that I needed to take care of or even express myself through. Yeah. But through that, I was able to pair that knowledge with my own knowledge of art and realize that we can express our art through our bodies, through our minds, through our spirits, through our hearts, and that there's so many different ways we can do that. And how could we say that a hockey player isn't an artist when you watch the way they move so gracefully on the ice? I can't move that way. When, a play doesn't work out the way that they want it to, they have to use their imagination to come up with a new play right away. That's something that I don't have the skills to do. They're an artist. They're a master of that craft of producing art using their body. And so it's taken such a long time, and I think I still feel very judgmental of myself sometimes. I still feel very much like I'm not like my dad. But I'm learning to embrace myself fully, embrace those 4 parts of myself, my whole being, and realizing that the way that I express myself through those 4 parts of myself does make me an artist, and I am creating in this world.
It sounds like you're kind of, forgive me for maybe summarizing a little bit here, but like your journey of self-discovery through art, or your artistic journey of self-discovery, has been really linked with reconciling all these different aspects of your human nature, let's say, or that's what I like to call it, but I'm not going to copyright that. So I guess my first question is, how do you think that helped you through the process of kind of living through some of the traumas that you've had, and your journey as a young woman, and how has your how has your art supported you in that journey of like healing and wellness, particularly as you kind of grew up?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you mistakenly said heart, because when we think of like these 4 parts of our being, I definitely lead with my heart. I'm a very emotional being. The things that bring me the most fulfillment is when I'm able to share from that heart space and receive into that heart space. And when I was young, I was very challenged because I was sexually abused at the age of around 7. Never told my parents. At around the age of 16, 17, I found out that that person was a repeat offender and had sexually abused another person from my community, and felt this immense amount of guilt. I felt very responsible for that, and it really broke me, and I became an alcoholic at a really young age because I was trying to numb those feelings of guilt. And my mom is one of the most fierce and supportive people in my life. She's always been there. No matter what situation has presented itself, and no matter what challenges she went through, she was always there for us as a mother. And so she took it upon herself to put me into different things. She brought me to the doctor. She got me the referrals for different therapies and counseling, and called the school and talked to the school to make sure that I was being supported. And through that and through her own research, she found a place that specialized in sexual abuse healing, and they had a focus on art therapy. And so that art therapy really changed my life. I think that for a lot of us, it can be hard to express ourselves because we live in a world where it can be shameful. It's not okay to show who you really are, when you don't fit in the perfect box. And so that, I think, was where most of my fear was. The other side of that was trust. I think as a person who experienced those challenges, but also as an Indigenous person, being in a space with a stranger and having to trust that they could heal you and take care of you was really hard. And so art therapy was that way that I could express myself without talking, without so many words. And that's a tool that I think that we've really lost in modern society, is that connection to that creative being that I was talking about. And I think that a lot of the world's suffering could be lessened if we were all more in touch with that creative being, because we don't always feel comfortable talking to someone else, but even then in life it's our own experience. So in some ways, we do need to be responsible for taking care of those hardships on our own. That doesn't mean we can't have friends who support us and counselors who support us, but that sometimes, it really is just us against the world. And art, for me, is that way that I could express those things without needing to count on anyone else. And as I began to tell my story through that art, and the burden of those things I was carrying became less, I felt less ashamed. And as a result of feeling less shame, I was able to share that story with people around me that I loved. And now I share my story very publicly in hopes that it can help someone else heal, or that someone can realize that they're not alone in what they experience. One of the hugest challenges for me growing up was that I was very severely bullied. I went to multiple schools, starting in grade 3 when I first moved to Vancouver, and I moved almost every year after that. And so in every school I went to, I always found myself alone, an outsider, never had friends. My younger sister was better at making friends, so I would hang out with her. She was 2 grades younger. Older people would make fun of me for hanging out with younger people, so it was a very isolating experience to be so bullied, and I felt very, very lonely. I thought, I am the only person in this world who thinks the way that I do. And that's an individual experience. It's true, but at the same time it wasn't. I didn't realize there was other people in the world who cared about humanity, who wanted the world to be a better place, who thought deeply about things and not just looked at the surface level. I didn't know that existed. And so a part of me feels that it's my responsibility to share my story, so that if there are people out there who feel like I did, that they realize it's okay to tell your story. It's okay to express yourself the way that you need to, and it's okay to create the way that speaks to you, whoever you are.
Why did you move so often every year? Was it because of the bullying?
No, I actually moved quite often because my parents were separated. That's why I moved down here, and they wanted us to spend equal time with them, and so we moved between them each year. But then with my mom being a single parent a lot of the time, we ended up staying with her mostly. And my dad was an artist, and that term, starving artist, it comes from somewhere. He wasn't always Bo Dick. He went through times where he couldn't sell any of his art, and so my mom was really financially supporting us alone. And so I think that resulted in a lot of the moving. And there were times in our lives where our parents were also on their healing journey and they weren't able to take care of us, and so we would live with our grandma. And so we had a very unconventional upbringing. We moved a lot, but that was very normalized for us. I personally used to feel relieved every time we moved, because I thought it was a chance to start over again and to not be bullied and to hopefully make friends this time. And it never worked out the way that I hoped it would, but I had hope. And I think that experience of realizing that no matter where you go, that you might still experience challenges, helped me become a more adaptable person in life. And then with the moving all the time, I feel like I can easily fit into so many different situations. So even though as a young person that was really hard, I think now it's become a really positive strength in my life. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool. So now I want to kind of shift gears a little bit more into kind of what you've been up to lately, I guess, now. Can you kind of walk me through a little bit more how you utilize your art now to impact your work, particularly at We Now? That was
We Matter.
We Matter.
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you feel that your art either directly impacts that work or supports you in that way? And if so, how? And then if not, how does it support your personal life? Because I think that everyone's work it's, well, not everyone's, but lots of people's work is kind of a part of, it's a part of who you are, and I think that if you're not supporting yourself holistically outside of the work, then the work will suffer. So, in my view, your art has to support you somewhere.
Yeah.
But could you maybe walk me through a little bit there?
Yeah, I think it happens a little bit both ways, where
Okay.
my work really influences my art, and my
Mhm.
art really influences my work. They're
Mhm.
very interchangeable. But what my poetry journey started with was a really good friend of mine, Janine Frey Najutli. She's a performance artist, a Gwich'in woman. She asked me if I could share some of my poetry for a magazine submission, a feature that she was doing. And so I was very apprehensive. First of all, she'd never read my poetry. She just believed in me.
Okay.
And that's important. That was what really gave me that courage.
Mhm.
And the second thing was that my dad had just passed away, and he had always said, gifts are meant to be shared. He always encouraged me to share my poetry, and I just felt like it was such a vulnerable and embarrassing experience that I never did. And so those two things is like having someone believe so strongly in you, and also knowing that you need to push yourself to get to that next stage in life is why I agreed to. And the poem was called The Canvas, the Art, the Artist, and it was about how we are these three things. We are the canvas in life, we are the art, but we are also the artist. And so that's where I started, and that was the very first time publicly sharing my poem. Shortly after that, maybe a month or two after that, I got a job working with We Matter. And one of the co-founders of We Matter, her name is Tenchai Redford. She's an amazing, amazing Indigenous poet, and she comes from the Dene people, and she has this really beautiful way of being encouraging. And when I told her that I write poetry, immediately she was like, oh, I'm a poet too, and the poetry community is so embracing. They are so open. It's one of the most beautiful communities to be a part of. And so that gave me the courage to take that next step, to seek out somewhere where I could share that poetry. And just a lot of these things happen very uncannily in my life. I think they're blessings. And I think they come from gratitude and appreciation. But the next day, I open my email, and there's an email, and it says that someone is looking for someone to share poetry at the opening of their book release. And so I went and I shared poetry, and was so nervous, and my voice was shaking, but I got through it. And then when I went back to work the next day, I realized how important it was for youth, not just Indigenous youth, but youth in general, to be recognized for their gifts, for their individuality, and to be supported and nurtured through that. But then working with We Matter, our main campaign is called the We Matter campaign, and we have a library, an online-based library of video messages from Indigenous people across Canada, just sharing their own stories, so that when youth access those videos, they can realize that they're not alone in their experiences. There's always a way forward. And I really learned that through that, and seeing people express themselves so authentically, and to realize that those people too had felt pain as much as I had, really opened me up, and it made me really begin to blossom as a poet and to want to share with others. And so I still feel like I'm very much a baby in my journey, even though I've been writing poetry since I was a young girl, because I still feel like embarrassed. And I share my poetry on my Instagram, and like every poem I put, Like, immediately after posting it, I just want to delete it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, oh, this is so vulnerable, and people are seeing a side of me that I when I'm writing my poetry, it's just me and the paper.
Mm-hmm.
It's just me expressing my own self, my deepest thoughts, the things that I've never said to anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you share that, you're changing it. You actually are sharing it with someone else, and it becomes less intimate and more about your connection with the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that having a connection with the world is very scary. And I think that's why a lot of people really shy away from it. They don't use their gifts, and they live in a way that's very, day to day. They go to their jobs and they come home and they make dinner, and they live their lives in this way because it's safe.
Mm-hmm.
And not everyone, some people, that is their gift in life, is to be a mother or something like that, cooking for their children. But that's not everyone's gifts, but I think that we feel a little bit trapped, where in society that's what we have to do. We have to work, we have to pay our bills. Hopefully one day we can afford a house, which we might never make it to.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you realize that you have a connection with the world, it is scary. Mm-hmm. It is a responsibility.
Yeah.
And you realize the power you have, and you just want to shut it out right away because you're like, I do not want to be responsible for the power I have to impact the lives of other people. Mm-hmm. But then you realize that you can heal people. You can help people out of their deepest depths of sorrow. And shed just a little bit of light so that they can see their own light. And that's the most fulfilling feeling, and that's why I do it. And no matter what fear I have, I just know that the gift is worth it.
It's really, excuse me. I think it's interesting that you brought up that piece about the differences between writing poetry and then sharing it. Mm-hmm. Because I think that's well, obviously it's true for any art form, but I found that I really resonated with that piece as well, because I think we all, in our own intimate or individual lives, have an art that we practice, just mm-hmm. as you said before, right? But it's very different to become known for that art publicly, and like mm-hmm. you said, to connect with the world, and for that to be shown, I suppose, as kind of like your exterior self. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? You become known for that, in the same way that your father was, right? And still is, that mm-hmm. he still lives on through his art, right? And I think I can't possibly speak to the emotional perspective of that, because I don't share any art. I'm an avid art consumer, but I guess my question comes down to, when you think about your father and the legacy that he's left through his art, mm-hmm. do you ever think about what that means for you, what your art is telling people, and how that will be remembered in your legacy? Or is it just something so far off you don't even think about it?
I try not to think about legacy so much, because I think that the idea that people have about legacy is that for one's legacy to be great, they had to have had public accomplishment. And mm-hmm. I choose to live a little bit more humbly than that, where if that happens, I embrace it and accept it and appreciate it. Mm-hmm. But when it doesn't, I remind myself that if I could just reach one person. Like when I do public speaking, I get on that stage, I'm not telling myself I'm going to do a good job and everyone's going to love it, and if everyone doesn't love it, then I've failed. Mm-hmm. I don't tell myself that. I tell myself I'm going to go out there, and if just one person is impacted, inspired, starts to realize that they can heal, mm-hmm. it's good enough for me. And that's what I do it for, is for that one person every time. And if there's more than one person, I'm fortunate. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, they're fortunate, and the world becomes a better place. And that's really what I do it for. But in terms of my dad's legacy, I do feel an immense amount of responsibility to continue that on. He's shared with me so many teachings throughout my life that I think could benefit so many people. Like I say, I didn't realize I was privileged until I was much older. And having that knowledge, to me, is the same as like having that art, is where I could keep it inside, but when I express it, it creates something new and a different kind of energy that then goes out in the world and continues to do its work. And so when it comes to my dad, I think I really like to even just humanizing him a little bit more. In my life, admiring my dad, he was so unattainable. He was up on this pedestal. I could never be that. And something, though, that even I didn't realize at the time was just that my dad was so very human. He made mistakes. He had regrets in life. He carried pain with him. He, woke up with the same suffering that we all do living in this society. And if there's one thing that I would love to convey to people, it's that thing about him, that if you admire him a lot and you want to be like him, then also learn to embrace those mistakes that you've made and those things that have hurt you, because that's been a huge part of his journey, and I think that's the part that nobody gets to see. But also just emanating that by having that transparency with myself, where when I am sharing my own story, not just sharing the fluffy, beautiful, pleasant things, but just, the rainbows and the sunshine, but also sharing those difficult times, that the storms, the dark place you feel like you can never come back from. Those are all equally important in life. And so that's what I've learned from watching and learning from my dad and seeing the way that he's impacted people around him.
That's beautiful. I think kind of growing up, I think we all idolize our parents for sure, and it must have been. It must be even more difficult when the rest of the world kind of idolizes your parents as well. But I think for me, realizing that my father was human and had a lot of flaws, it only made me closer to them as an individual, right? And I'm sure that must be the case for you as well, because we grow up I don't mean to project. I grew up acutely aware of all of my flaws, and I think everyone does. And I think the moment that you realize that your parents are human and that they have flaws as well, it made me connect to them more. I was like, oh, I can see that now, and in particularly in the context of Indigenous families, we talk about intergenerational trauma a lot. I almost find that it makes me feel better. It gives an explanation to some of the things that we see. Or some of the things that we feel or experience, even if we don't have words for it. We don't understand why we feel uncomfortable in spaces. Then you can look at the history of your families and look at your parents and even your grandparents and understand that that's part of where that comes from. You know what I mean?
Also, like for myself, my journey with my dad was very normal. There were times in my life where I just could not stand him and blamed all of my life's issues on, it's both my parents' fault that I'm here now. And when I first came forward about being sexually abused, my dad kind of became absent in my life. And so that was very confusing for me. I was very angry at him. I didn't talk to him for like half a year, which for me was a very long time, because I always had a close relationship with my dad because he was my friend. And so I began to feel really resentful of him. And I thought that he cared about everyone else more than he cared about me, because during this time he was continuing to work, continuing to do the art, continuing to show up to ceremony, but not showing up in my life. And I didn't get that. I didn't understand, and it just made me really angry. And so one day I'm just sitting on the couch watching TV with my mom, and her phone rings, and she goes in the room, and she's talking really quiet and, like, kind of whispering, and she sounds a little intense. She comes out, and she says, "Your dad wants to talk to you." And so I got on the phone, and I was scared.
Must have been a big moment.
It was a big moment. And what he said to me was, "I am so sorry I wasn't there for you. I can't get that back. What I've been dealing with is my own guilt because that happened to you. I feel responsible. I feel like I failed as a parent. But not only that, I was sexually abused as a child. And my family told me not to tell anyone because it would bring shame on our family." And he apologized, and he said, "I just didn't know how to be there for you when I felt like I failed you, because I told myself when that happened to me in my life that I would never allow my children to feel that they didn't have a voice." And so that was what he was struggling with. And even though he was absent and maybe, he dealt with it in a way that wasn't good for me, learning that about him was like, wow. I now have this deeper connection with him. I now realize that if someone can be as amazing as my dad is and gone through the same thing that I'm going through right now, then it is possible for me to get through it. And then it became this thing of just look at my dad because he's thriving now. And so, the healing journey is so complicated, but that was the challenge for me with my dad. And I think one of the coolest things about my own healing journey is getting to watch others heal around me, and something that I've really seen within both my parents is their pride in their children really inspires them to be better people. I've seen my mom and my dad become miraculously different people from when I was a little girl. And I know that for a lot of people, there's a point in their life where they kind of stop growing and they stop learning and they stop being open to those experiences. But my parents, whatever they went through, they continued to role model that you can change, you can grow, you can keep going. And so that was like probably one of the most beautiful gifts that I cherish so much from sharing my healing journey and becoming an artist. And also for the sideline cheers, my mom is my hugest fan. She is on the webinar right now. Shout out to my mom.
Wow.
And I'm pretty sure she circulated my webinar widely at UVic because she works there. And I think it's really nice that for me, I had a friendship with both my parents as well. And that changed things a lot for me, I think. And I think that it also changed the way that I relate to my child, where I'm very much her friend and I'm a parent, but my job isn't to tell her what to do, it's to guide her to become the best version of her own self. And she actually is visually artistic. She just was born with this gift of drawing and painting, and she's just always had that visually creative spirit. And even though I'm not a visual artist, I never want her to look at me and be like, oh, I want to be a poet like my mom. If that's not who she is, I want her to feel empowered in her own journey throughout the way. And luckily I'm able to do that because that's what my parents have done for me throughout my life.
Yeah. Artistic talent runs in the family, I guess.
Yeah.
That's nice. Maybe that explains why I don't have any. So, I sorry to shift gears again a little bit abruptly here, but so I wanted to chat a little bit more about how you feel that your art specifically impacts other people's lives, because we've talked around it a little bit in terms of how it impacts other people's healing, but what do you think, two-part question, what do you think are the biggest impacts of your work or of art generally in healing?
Mm-hmm.
Where can that art take space in that healing place, let's say, or along that healing journey?
Mm-hmm.
How can it help people start that process? Actually, that's a big question. Let's just go with that one first.
Yeah. It's hard. I have so many different things that I believe about art and how they heal.
Mm-hmm.
And they all heal, the very various mediums, they all heal a little bit differently. And all artists, the way that they share creates a different healing energy. So it's kind of hard to pinpoint what it is about artists that allows them to create such a powerful healing. But I think that for my own self, in sharing my poetry, not everyone's going to be a poet.
Mm-hmm.
But I grew up in spaces where there wasn't space for poetry. In the communities and in the schools I went to, there were so many different types of sports, but never poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And so knowing that I could use that as a tool to begin to heal didn't come until later in life, because I wasn't given those opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I share my poetry, I'm hoping that I'm creating an opportunity for somebody to heal.
Yeah.
And you think about humankind and individual experience, where we all communicate very differently with the world. That's how misunderstandings happen. They're very normal because the way we communicate is so vastly different from someone else, even if they seem or appear to communicate the same way as you. And so I think that's why artists as a community really create a huge impact, because, we've got someone who likes to paint things that are dark, maybe. Mm-hmm. Maybe they are very emotional, maybe even a little unpleasant to look at. Mm. But for someone who feels...
You're talking about the piece right now, right? Not the artist?
Yeah.
Okay.
The artistic piece. Yeah. Some of us artists feel that darkness too.
It's a little hard to look at sometimes. Sorry, continue.
But for someone who, for me, I am a rose-colored glasses Pollyanna. Mm-hmm. Looking at something like that might make me feel a little uncomfortable, to be honest. Yeah. But for someone else, and even some of my friends, I could think of people would look at that and feel like, wow, that's everything I've been feeling inside. And now, by having a connection with this art piece, I've been able to release some of those feelings. Mm-hmm. And I've learned that it's okay to have darkness, because this person shared their darkness right here on canvas. So it must be okay to express that part of myself. And so when it comes to artists, I think they just are so diverse and so unique, and that's the thing that's really impactful. As an artist, as a poet, not everyone's going to like my poetry. I can't hope that I will create healing for everyone. But if there's a young boy or girl or a person who's like me and just feeling like they're not fitting in anywhere in the world, that they're surrounded by people who are so gifted, but that there's no space for someone who has their gifts, that they could look at that and say, well, she's doing it. Mm-hmm. She's sharing herself. And she's healing, so I can do it too. And I think that's why it's important for more people to connect to their creative being, to find that one thing that they could express that energy through, to make a difference. Yeah. And but I also feel that there's a lot of responsibility on schools, centers, communities, people that support others, to recognize that diversity and offer that diversity. When I was in art therapy, they didn't say, hey, draw on this paper. They said, well, we're going to try painting today, and if you don't like that, tomorrow we're going to try clay, and if you don't like that, the next day we can try doing some free writing. And that just like helped me discover what it was I wanted to express myself through, because I didn't know at the time. And I think that we don't ever know until we get there. And so when you give more messages of and more options of ways that people can heal, then I think that it's easier to get there, because you're walking down the street one day and you find it, and it's more possible. It becomes more possible when you know that someone else is living that similar journey to you. And so, I don't have a specific thing about artists that makes me feel like they in particular are special, because I believe that all people are artists and every single person is special, but some people haven't figured out in what way they are yet.
Nice, yeah. I think it kind of reflecting on what you're saying, I guess like art is a way for us to have a nonverbal in the sense that we don't have to share ourselves explicitly, but we can still participate in an intimate conversation about human experience, human existence. And in that way you can almost, like you said, like you can connect and support people that may not access that in a different setting. Just like you talked about with art therapy and the differences between traditional, we'll say the Western therapy or Western psychotherapy as opposed to art therapy. Some people just aren't comfortable taking up that space and sharing themselves in that way, but just as you mentioned, like, if you can experience an art piece, whether or not that's, for me, it's always been about music. Like, I really connect to even nonverbal music. I can feel the emotion, and I can see the colors and I can feel it. You know what I mean? Not that I can create music, so don't confuse those two things, but like, do you know what I mean? That's the way that I feel as though I can connect with people, and it's been a wonderful experience for me. So I guess reflecting on your answer, by engaging with your art, or by your art being open or available for people to engage with, you hope that it creates a space for an intimate conversation to be had.
And you can't make can't make anything happen.
Yeah.
And so having that standpoint and realizing I could put this art out there, but then step back and just let it do its job is really important, because you can't make someone want to heal.
Yeah.
You can't make someone see your art for what it is. And that's the other thing that's really unique too, is that one piece of art, everyone has a different connection with it. They have a different relationship with it. And I think that the art just really does its own job. And I think it's because artists put so much of themselves into it that the art itself carries its own spirit. That's why you can have a relationship with it, because it's alive. And that's like part of my own spiritual and personal beliefs.
That's very cool. Very, very cool. I was going to say something cool and thoughtful, and then you just blew me away with that. So I'm just going to move on to different... so we have some comments from our webinar,
awesome.
Both private and public. Angela, inspired by your honesty, love, and courage. Thank you, Linnea.
Aww.
Maria
so
Amastoy, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. I'm very proud of you, Linnea. Your bravery and honesty talks loud and clear about your qualities as a warrior you are. Thank you for offering a model of surviving and moving forward in life. A real honor to attend your webinar.
Wow.
Georgia Campbell, it's encouraging to hear how your experiences of adversity and childhood trauma inspire your creativity and your work in poetry, and what it means to overcome those diverse adversities. A very unique and inspiring leader. Can't wait to read some of your works. So on that point, we'll make sure to have links to your Instagram and other available, any and all available resources to make sure that they can connect with you further as an artist. Pam Bevan.
That's my mama.
There we go. Hi, babe. I'm so proud of you for sharing your story. I've been watching, listening, trying not to cry happy tears. Love you to the moon and back. Choose a question. Have you published your poetry? And if so, where can one get a copy? If not, you really should. Mom, heart.
Okay. I don't know if she's like actually asking me or she's trying to do a little PR. She's like, come on, honey, let them know. I have only had individual pieces published. My first piece that was published was in C Magazine with Janine, and I doubt that issue is still available. And then I published a poem in the book Revolutionary Spirit, which was my dad's kind of first legacy exhibition we did after he passed away, and I co-curated it with the O'Dane Art Museum, and I was asked if I could contribute a poem. And so the poem is actually about my dad. And I was really inspired to write the poem because he would buy me poetry books from Indigenous writers from around the world. And there was a different kind of way that Indigenous poets to use that art form to tell stories, because storytelling is a huge part of Indigenous communities. And so I decided to use it almost to tell this kind of like myth about my dad, because people used to always joke and say, oh, the myth, the legend, Bo Dick, as a joke. But I think that because of the life he lived and how much he accomplished in his life, he has a very enigmatic character that I wanted to put on paper, which eventually will become its own book, but it's going to take years to write, because that's my relationship with my dad, and wanting to do one of those long poems that tells one story in a book. And then I have, I think I have a couple other pieces, but I have a piece that will be coming out in the Capilano Review, and that piece is called Saligyet, and Saligyet in Kwakwala means mourning, and the poem itself is about those 7 stages of grief. But the reason I wanted to call it mourning is because the difference between the two, even though they're pretty synonymous, is that grief is what happens inside. So those 7 stages of grief. But I called it mourning because it was that grief, taking that grief, and how does it transform itself into my life. And so I take you through those different stages of grief and how I've healed through each of those stages through a poem. Yeah.
That's beautiful. We'll be sure to try to round up as many of these links as we can. So for anybody that's watching and you want to access them, we'll try to make them available after the session. We actually do have another couple comments here.
Cool.
Georgia asks, what was your biggest hurdle in your healing journey, and how did you incorporate that into your creative work?
My biggest hurdle was and continues to be myself. The stories that we tell ourselves are so impactful, and there's days where I wake up and I tell myself that the world is unfair, that I didn't deserve any of the things that happened to me, starting from the young child Linnea till now. And so I've had to learn to have control of the mind, because the mind, I don't believe that the mind is an expression of your true self. Your mind, the way that it expresses itself, couldn't be your true self, that supernatural being that every person can become. Because I don't believe that being that exists within you would want to tell you that you're worthless, that you can't do it, to be afraid of things. I believe that supernatural being that exists inside us wants healing and love and good for everyone. And so I've had to learn to understand my mind and realize that that's the hugest barrier towards my healing. And the main thing that I had to overcome with that mind is victimizing myself. Now, was I a victim of sexual abuse? Yes. But now I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. I'm no longer that victim. And, people do cause pain in our lives, but it's my responsibility not to carry that pain forward
Mm-hmm.
and give it to other people, because when we carry that pain, sometimes we hurt people around us because we just need so badly to get it out of us. And for a very long time, I really blamed everyone around me. And I did well for a few years before my dad passed away, where I just had a new ownership of self, where I was like, this is me, my experience.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what happens outside me, I'm not going to let that change who I am. Mm-hmm. So if someone does something that's hurtful and nasty and mean, and I become an angry person, I'm changing who I want to be, who I believe that I truly am. So learning to react calmly and to create boundaries, but not to attack people back. Mm-hmm. But what happened when my dad passed away was I was so angry at the world. How dare Creator or anyone take away someone who had as many gifts as him? Mm-hmm. How unfair that would happen in life. And I had little faith. You know, I'm a very spiritual person, and lost that connection to my faith, that belief that there's a greater purpose in the world. And as a result of that, no matter what I experienced, it was always someone else's fault. And luckily, I have a very supportive partner who could go through that with me. But, you know, everything was his fault as well. Mm-hmm. He couldn't do anything right. And there was a point where I got to the end of that, had a realization of who I was becoming, or kind of regressing back to. And I had so much gratitude for the people who stuck around, who went through that with me, and who continued to see who I truly was inside. And I was very fortunate. But I think for a lot of people, we can be really harsh with the people closest to us as a result of that victimization, as a result of saying, all this bad thing in the world that's happening to me can't be my fault, so it must be your fault, and it must be your fault, and it must be your fault, it must be Creator's fault. That was what I really had to learn to not do. And I had to learn, and to do that, I had to learn to tell myself a different story. And it's hard, especially when you lack confidence, or you lack support, or, you know, you're having a moment of weakness. You feel like you're not strong enough to do that.
Yeah.
But I think that that's everyone's journey, and I still have moments where I am not in touch with that being, that I know that I truly am, that conscious being, that supernatural person. And I have human folly. I make mistakes, I blame people, and I can be mean sometimes. But instead of making excuses about it, I say to myself, what I did caused me to feel guilt because what I did was wrong. So the next time this happens, instead of getting angry, I'm going to get vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And so that's another thing that's really important, is vulnerability. A lot of us hide that vulnerability behind our anger, especially. So much easier to get angry at someone than to admit that they hurt you. So much easier to blame others than to admit that you're carrying pain. So much easier to inflict suffering than to admit that you're suffering. And so these are all really important things to learn, and vulnerability is an essential tool for getting through those things. I still have times where I feel some sort of pain and I get into conflict mode, where it's like, you hurt me, you know, you're a bad person for doing that, and all of that. But then it's remarkable how people respond when, instead of doing that, you can actually sit in front of them and cry and say, the way that you expressed yourself to me made me feel bad about who I am. The way that they respond will be so much different. And so vulnerability is an essential thing to healing. You have to lean into those uncomfortable feelings. You have to lean into the pain. And that's not easy.
Yeah. Wow. where, as this kind of conversation is evolving, and I didn't mean to kind of bring it here, but something you said inspired this question for me, and that is, where do you think that your poems come from? Do they come from you as a supernatural being? Do they come from the mind? Do they come from the creator? Where do you think that they come from?
For myself, being someone that leads from the heart, I think a lot of it does come from my heart.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it also comes from that whole self, a connection of those things. Because for example, each one of my poems has a different voice. When I read it out loud, it has a different voice. It has its own personality, and that comes from, I believe, the body. It's being given its own persona. It has its own emotional mood. It has different references, that come from the mind, from knowledge. As you go through life, you attain knowledge, and those things influence your work. And then spirit. Spirit's a big one, and I think that's the one that is harder to identify. And so for anyone who might not know what spirit is a belief in something greater than yourself. And so for some people that's God, for some people that's creator, for some people, that's their faith in Buddhism. There's so many different ways that we can connect to that spirit. And I express that spirit through my poetry as well. That connection to all, or to that higher power that we might not understand. And trying to put words to something like that is a challenge. But I feel like in doing so, I become more connected to my spirit. When I put my heart on paper, I become more connected to my heart. When I'm able to express myself using my body, I feel more confident in my body afterwards. And so I think that it comes from all places, but naturally when I sit down and I write a poem, it's coming from an emotional place. But the other place that it kind of comes from is the higher person that I can become. It's a lot of the things that I share on my Instagram are poems of things I wish someone said to me, or things that I'm saying to myself from that higher place. Because I think that we each have those two beings within us. And one of those beings is that person who wants to connect with others, who wants to connect with the world, who wants to create good and kindness and express themselves through the energy of love. But there's the other side of us that is so susceptible to fall into any of those traps, such as addictions or anger or like low self-esteem. And so I talk from that place of supernatural understanding to my human self, and I say, here are the things that you need to learn through this experience, or through what you're feeling right now. And I amaze myself sometimes. I don't realize that I actually have the answers sometimes until I'm writing them on paper, and I'm like, wow, now I know how I can get through this. And then I get excited and I share them on Instagram, because I'm like, I hope that someone else will see this poem and have that moment of realization like I just did.
Right. Cool. Thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have another question, and that is, who are the poets or artists in general, I mean, apart from your dad, who have been important in your healing journey?
Oh, gosh. So, there's a few. I think in, previous times, one of the poets I really admire is Rumai. And he was a philosopher, and the way he shares is through that connection with philosophy and spirit and nature. The way that he shares nature is so different, but his poems are very, very old, very, very old, and they've been translated into English. And then the other person is Sylvia Plath, because when I learned about Sylvia Plath in women's studies in grade 11, for the first time I realized that it's okay to express those more deep sides of yourself that cause so much anguish. And prior to having that connection with Sylvia Plath, I used to think that it was only important to share yourself in a positive way. Like, I felt very against inflicting my pain on others, is how I felt it was. Like, I was like, if I share my anguish with someone, they're going to feel anguish, and that's not fair to them. But because I was so inspired and moved by her poetry, I realized that there was another side to it. And then for modern day poets, Rupi Kaur, I didn't think that I was actually going to like her poetry, but a friend of mine went to a bookstore and got me a signed copy. And she's like, I know you're a poet. And this was before I was on my poetry journey, but just there was certain people I was close to in life that I shared that. And my best friend, her name is Karen, and she got me this book. And I was so inspired by the way that she used her heritage and connection to her culture through her poetry to create awareness specifically as an Indian woman, as an East Indian woman. And so that's what really inspired me about her, and just how honest she was. It also was the first kind of poetry style that I'd read that didn't really have that, like, you know, that structure. And so I realized it's okay sometimes to just express yourself and then piece it together after into a poem. I'm not sure that's what her process is, but that's what I learned from her poetry. Tanchai Redvers, who's also the co-founder of We Matter, is one of my hugest influences, and she writes her poetry from the perspective as an Indigenous person, but her book is really inspiring because she talks about her healing journey, especially as a young Indigenous person, like as a youth. Those parts of ourselves that sometimes don't heal until much later in life. And so I was very inspired by that. Her book is called Fireweed, and the fireweed for her, in her traditions, is very significant of how, you know, fireweeds, they only grow after a massive forest fire, and how something so beautiful can sprout from something like that. And so the metaphor itself is inspiring. And then just to take it a little bit differently, a rapper that I'm really inspired by is Kendrick Lamar. He's an amazing poet, and my connection with music has always been about the lyrics. Even a well-produced song that only has, like, one chorus that repeats itself that everyone else loves, I can't get into it because it lacks that depth for me. But Kendrick Lamar, he has a lot of depth in his raps, and it's kind of funny because my dad was introduced to Kendrick Lamar, and he loved his raps. Like, he would be like, oh, throw my Kendrick Lamar mixtape on, and and so Kendrick Lamar was is one of my influences as well. So I have a very diverse group of people that I'm really influenced by in terms of poetry, but my poetry is also very diverse. I feel like something that I notice about the poets that I really inspire is that they have a style, and I'm not sure that I do yet. I'm not sure if I ever will, because I just express whatever comes out. And so, you know, poem to poem, they're all, like, really different. Some of them are really connected to culture, spirit, and nature, and metaphorical, where some are more like empowerment, words of support and hope. And so I'm still, I think, finding my voice and discovering more about my style as I go on. But I also think that diversity is super important to me, and to continue to produce things that even myself might make myself feel uncomfortable. One of the poems I recently shared on my page was so different from all of the other ones, and so I asked my partner Josh, I was like, oh, should I share this? And he said, well, it's different than everything else you have on there, but I think it's important to share it because of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm getting into more of the habit of just sharing and like not focusing so much on what does this look like to others. Is it a style? Do the people that follow me, are they gonna like this because they followed me for my other style? It's just like really like humbling myself, because that's ego. That insecurity comes from ego. Just humbling myself and letting the process take place however it needs to.
It's funny because I always assume that artists don't really. There must be a very challenging thing to like constantly be, especially as I imagine as you shifted into sharing your poetry more publicly, that it becomes more about things like, not more about, sorry, but like you start to focus on things like style and about the way that you write, I would imagine, and how that comes across or how it translates. Whereas if it's just for you, then it's not.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's a different sort of thing, and I can appreciate that must be difficult, but from my place of ignorance, I would just say, like, just keep doing you, because 10, 15 years from now, we're just going to call that all over the place. That's just going to be Linea style, and then poets will grow up and be like, I'm a Linea style writer.
Yeah.
And now I'm just all over the place.
I think it's like
Do you know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's like a balance, because that's really what my dad, well, a little bit differently, but that's what he learned to do, because he loved doing art, clearly. You can see that in his pieces.
Yeah.
But he also, he had a passion, creativity, things that he really wanted to explore and do with his art that might not sell. And so what he carved, like, every time he got a commission, it was for Dunakwa or Pukmis, and he was just so sick of doing those pieces, and he could do them so well because he got commissions for them so often.
Yeah.
But I would sit in his studio with him, and he'd be carving, and all of a sudden he'd be, need to put that down for a minute. And then he'd pick up his kind of like side project and start working on that. And then you could see that his energy would shift. And then he'd be all happy, and he'd be, want to go get a coffee, and come back, and he'd be ready to get back to working on that other thing.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one of the dangers that all artists face, is like the need to sell out yourself to make a living. But I think we're learning more and more in today's society that we can have both, and that doesn't mean that we want to sell out our work or just produce what people want. But when you have that stage, when you have that thing that can accelerate your public persona, for example, then you have more of a voice to share those other more unconventional things that people might not recognize. And so I think that's what he did, is he was known for the pieces he was known for. But when people were drawn in by that into his world, he got to share a lot of the other stuff.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
So it's almost come to that time, so I'm going to kind of transition into our outro a little bit. If you have any last minute questions or comments for Linnea, please make sure that you pop it in the chat box, and I'll come and check it in a second. So I just wanted to express my sincere thanks, gratitude to you, Linnea, for coming on, joining us in Circle, and sharing with me and with us a little bit about your journey and about, I guess, the healing powers of your art and how that's impacted your life. I feel as though I have a lot of stuff to go away and think about in a quiet corner, because that's my style. So I truly appreciate it. Coming up for the rest of the month, February will be a little bit quiet for us. We have Summer Science is going to come on and chat with us a little bit about their programming and how you could get involved with the Summer Science program this year. They're going to be on later this week. And then into March, we'll have sessions with Denise. Denise Finley is going to talk to us a little bit about Indigenous healing rituals and a few other programs that she's involved with. We're also going to have some sessions on food, some sessions on cultural safety. So March is going to be jam-packed for us. We hope that you'll be able to join us for that time. Just checking the chat box. Mom says Georgia Campbell is your auntie, auntie your grandpa's sister. So there you go.
Thanks, Mom.
Forever teaching us. So I think with that, I think we're good, and I wanted to say thank you all very much for joining us in Circle as well and contributing your thoughts.
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay. So until next time, take care.